So yes, I am Chef Jim Whaley, and I have been spending a lot of my, I guess you could say, like the latter part of my chef career, really trying to do more mindful or meaningful work. So we were discussing a little bit before, a few minutes ago, that about July 2009, I really started thinking about how, as a chef that has been in the industry for 30-some years, how could I really try to focus more on supporting our local food system, our local farmers, really promoting and encouraging all of us together to eat more real food. So I have been in the past, I recently finished up 2 years as a board member with the Community Farm Alliance, and they're a grassroots advocacy group. They do a lot of policy work in Frankfort, Kentucky for local farmers, local producers. And more recently, I'm also now on the board for Slow Food Bluegrass. And that was how I wanted to sort of present this presentation to you today, because I know a lot of you guys are already pretty knowledgeable about food, local food. That's why you're here. That's why you're supporting our farmers. That's why the farmers market is here. But I thought that we might have the opportunity to go just a little bit deeper, or maybe one step further in our knowledge continuum with local food. And what I wanted to talk about is the slow food. Slow food embraces a lot of different principles, and one of the principles that's really important to slow food is what they call the Ark of Taste. And the Ark of Taste pretty much puts the spotlight on foods that are considered to be in danger of either slipping away or literally becoming extinct. And those foods can be fruits, they can be vegetables, they could be different animals. If you get on the Slow Food website and just look for Ark of Taste, you'll see that there are 200 varieties of plants and animals that have been identified here in America as being on the Slow Food Ark of Taste. This is one of them, and we can kind of take for granted because when we come to the market, we see these wonderful heirloom varieties of different fruits and vegetables. This is the Cherokee purple tomato, and thank goodness that we support our local farmers that do preserve seed and then plant their seeds perennially every year. If this were not a perennial type plant, if the seed did not have the capacity to germinate itself and reproduce itself again, we wouldn't have these heirloom varieties. And I personally do think that there probably is much more nutritional value in a plant that still has the capacity to germinate and reproduce itself, rather than a plant that has gone through either modification or hybridization, and for those reasons the plant has now mutated or changed into something that maybe best suits what our purposes were intended for, but now that plant no longer has the capacity to reproduce. So all of our heirloom varieties, all of our heritage varieties have the capacity to reproduce themselves. So in the Ark of Taste, there's quite a few varieties of tomatoes. The Cherokee tomato has its name comes from someone in Tennessee who preserved these seeds, who has said that these actually came from the Cherokee Indians. The Cherokees were cultivating these tomatoes, and then they were sent from Tennessee, the seeds were sent to North Carolina to another individual there, and then they began saving and propagating these, as with a lot of our heirloom varieties, and we have these and a lot of other wonderful heirloom varieties. I also wanted to share with you guys along that line, if you guys heard of Bill Best, he is locally, and he lives in Berea. He is originally, his family is from North Carolina, But this book, I would really encourage you guys to, if you're interested in learning more about the heritage and the history of heirlooms varieties, this book is called Saving Seeds, Preserving Taste. And Bill Best is up in Berea. He sells his vegetables up at the Lexington Farmers Market. And he has, what he's probably most known for are the different varieties of beans that his family has preserved, different types of green beans, pole beans, with all kinds of interesting names. But what's interesting about these heirloom varieties is they always, not only are they going to taste better, they're going to have more flavor, but there's also an interesting story behind these varieties of seeds, like the families, the communities, who preserves these seeds, where did they come from? And oftentimes families, generations ago, the prospect of their success as they moved through different parts of the country, part of the prospect of their success directly correlated to how successful they were at preserving and transporting their seeds with them, so that when they settled a new area, they had a way to start farming, they had a way to create some sustenance for themselves, and then of course as communities rooted deeper and stayed for longer periods of time, farmers could then go from just subsistence farming to for sharing and possibly selling to others as well. So the heirloom varieties have a lot of interesting history behind them too, whether it's vegetables or fruit. There's a chapter in here about apples, and in Kentucky, particularly as you go east, and you also see it if you go up toward northern Kentucky, we have a lot of apple orchards. But when you get into eastern Kentucky and the Appalachian region, from what I understand, there were at one time in all these wild orchards 200 to 300 different varieties of apples that were growing. And now we've lost maybe 100 of those different varieties, but we still, when you go into those ecosystems in Appalachia, there are still a lot of old and sometimes old abandoned fruit orchards where you can still see all these different varieties of apples. Unfortunately, what's happened in our food system is we have, because of the need for large production and transportation, we've sort of reduced the variety of apples that we have available to like 4 or 5 varieties, when really there's, hundreds of different varieties. The difference is all these heirloom varieties of apples were not grown, they weren't grafted, and they weren't cultivated to produce necessarily something that was extremely eye-pleasing or that reached a certain size. They were cultivated more for whatever their virtue was. If it was pressing for cider or cooking, mashing for applesauce or cooking apples, the apples had more of a functional purpose. So you had all these different varieties that were very atypical in size and color compared to the apples that we see now when we go to the grocery stores. But apples originally came from Central Asia, and I think around Kazakhstan, in that area, and then they were brought over by the Europeans. So again, if someone had not preserved the seed and then brought that seed with them, we wouldn't have all these apples or all the variety of apples. And then also, if we didn't have individuals who had the knowledge of how to graft a fruit branch into another fruit tree, we also wouldn't have the different varieties of apples, because grafting is another one of those food crafts, just like so many types of food crafts that were at one point in time essential to our survival, essential. When we didn't have refrigeration, we learned, we taught, it was either handed down to us or we learned how to preserve and cellar our meats and our vegetables. So in Bill's book, you hear about green beans that they called leather breeches, which leather breeches was sort of a term they used for how they strung and dried their beans. So essentially they were dehydrating them. But they could do this outdoors using the energy resources that were available, the energy of the sun, to dry their beans. So all these different food crafts could follow these heirloom and these different varieties of food. Now we're seeing, thank goodness, we're starting to see more of, I think, an awareness or a movement to revive these things. As more people come to the farmer's market, there's more of an interest among people coming to the market and learning how to can and preserve, because you wind up with such an abundance of things. You can't eat it all at once, so canning classes, preserving classes, how to use fermentation and how to properly harness the forces in nature that create the fermentation process. More is being explored around that, and we see a lot of local chefs now buying whole animals instead of just relying on the food system to bring to their operation meat already cut up in all kinds of different. What happens when you rely on just a large manufacturer or a large distributor is the meat gets cut up into maybe 5 or 6 primary cuts, and then all that other part of the animal, we don't know what happens to it. It goes into, so the full value doesn't get to the farmer or the producer in terms of what he gets per pound on the hoof for his animal, because there's only certain parts of it that are going to get sold for consumption. But if we, as chefs, are willing to learn or relearn the crafts of butchering, where we're comfortable with taking an entire animal and learning how to cut the primals and then take the primals and then break out all the other pieces, use the UofL, use the different organs, then we get all these wonderful recipes come back to us that have been around for generations, but we have just sort of divested ourselves from all of those, all the variety. The same thing again with, as we were talking about heirloom varieties, I really think that we were intended to eat or consume food from a wide spectrum or a really wide variety of different plants. And we have, I know we don't really, I don't think have scientific data for it, but I think that we could, I would say, I would lobby for the fact that if we could bring more variety in terms of what we eat back into our daily consumption, that I think some of the issues that we have with our health might abate themselves a little bit if we started eating again from a much wider variety of what was originally available to us in our ecosystem and what was originally grown and cultivated. So, all of that being said, since I didn't want to do a presentation without at least having a little bit of a demo today too. So what we're going to do with these beautiful Cherokee purples, and you can see that some of these do have in their shoulders that real rich sort of purple tone in them, is we're going to make a real quick and simple salsa with these tomatoes. And the elements for it, I didn't bring a written recipe for you guys because really this is so simple. You guys have probably made this yourselves lots of times, but when you have lots of fresh tomatoes, I like to use some fresh cilantro, get some hot peppers, and I think we got these from the market here. Put a little bit of fresh garlic, a little bit of sweet onion, And then also, if I have them, I like to squeeze a little bit of fresh lime and a little bit of salt and pepper. And then another thing I do is when I'm cutting up fresh tomatoes, especially for salsa, I will cut them up into like a colander because these are so juicy. You'll capture quite a bit of juice. So this little step is kind of handy. You can then save that juice, use it for something else later, maybe Bloody Marys or something like that. But I like to colander the cut tomatoes before I put them in my bowl, so that so your salsa is not quite so overly juicy. With these guys, since they are so big, you want to core the tomato first. And there are like those little tomato coring tools. I just like using a little paring knife myself. And I washed these tomatoes this morning. I picked them up last night from Fox Hollow Farms. So after the big storm subsided and I could get in my car, and I ventured out to points eastward to Fox Hollow. And it took me quite a while to get there because the storm had really slowed traffic down everywhere. So these tomatoes are so ripe. They're so luscious. I mean, we wait all year really for tomatoes like this. They're sort of the crown jewel of the summer harvest. So they're very easy to process. I think you do need a good sharp knife because the tomatoes are so soft that if your knife is dull and you wind up putting a lot of inordinate pressure, you wind up juicing your tomatoes instead of preserving the meat because they're so soft. So a couple good sharp knives, like a good sharp paring knife, you can take out those little spots, come around, get your core, and then of course in our household all these scraps we keep for our composter. And I've got one of those in our backyard. Since we're in the Highlands, we don't have an open compost, but we have one of those real nice tumblers which keeps everything enclosed in it. The tumbler actually seems to really speed up the whole composting process, I guess, because you're limiting the amount of air and it gets real hot in there. So all of our scraps go in there, and then we use those for everything that we grow in our backyard, front yard. Flowers, herbs, tomatoes, things that we grow or try to grow. So I'm just going to cut these up. These tomatoes are real fresh. You can see I'm already getting a lot of juice in here, and the longer you let them sit, you can draw a little bit more out of them. If you salt them a little bit, that kind of also helps promote the juicing process. So this core, and then I like to take that little part off there. And we're getting in our backyard, we're starting to get also a lot of raspberries and blackberries. And besides the cobblers and fresh berries, I like to you can make some nice summer beverages with fresh berries by steeping them in liquid. Or what I've been doing is taking the fresh raspberries and blackberries and muddling them with a little bit of sugar, and then I'll strain all of that into a glass after I've extracted a lot of the juice when they're real ripe, and then you can just pour like Perrier or club soda in there. You could you come up with a real nice summer beverage using the fresh berries. So let's do a few more of these guys, and then we'll start adding our other ingredients. So we're also putting some fresh local garlic, and this is from one of the vendors here. It's already nicely peeled, which is really nice, makes it real convenient when you're working with it in your kitchen to have it already peeled. And then we're also going to put some sweet onion, some cilantro, a little bit of salt and pepper, and squeeze a little bit of fresh lime into it. So whenever I'm doing an onion, I always like to share this because I know that everybody has a different way of cutting up an onion, but I like to follow the grain of the onion and cut it lengthwise first, and then leave the root part. Don't cut through it, but cut the ends off of your onion. Peel whatever you need to peel. Again, leaving the root part attached. We've got the onion peeled. So now we'll make those cuts, again following the grain of the onion, which goes from one end to the other. Then you can make a cut through the middle, but again, not cutting your stem, leaving your stem there. So now your stem is holding the onion together. Then you can just come along and make your dice. And the onion just sort of dices itself at that point.
Our mom should have taught us that. Right.
That's something, when I do cooking classes, I always try to remember to show that to everybody, because everybody kind of struggles with how to dice an onion. And other people have asked me about the fumes from onions, and I, as a chef who's worked with food for 30-some years, I don't know of anything that helps with onions in terms of stinging your eyes other than ventilation. Like if you can work around an area where maybe you have air moving through, and that moving air, like air conditioning, can move those fumes out. That's the only thing that I've seen that actually works. Okay, so our pepper, what I like to do here is just take out that inner core and then the seeds. Now if you really, really like it hot, you can leave those seeds in there. And then with your hot peppers, I like a small dice so that nobody gets a big piece of pepper.
We got those peppers today from Gypsy Ridge Farm.
And Gypsy Ridge are they in Indiana?
Yes.
And is he our Mennonite, one of our Mennonite farmers? Or
It's a family, yeah, it's a large community that runs that farm. And they therefore bring a lot of different produce. So we've been happy to have them. They've been here for 5 years now.
Mm-hmm. They were weren't they one of the first?
Yep, they were here the first year. And they've stuck with us. I was just saying that to somebody that, we're so lucky because we now have, our farmers have stuck with us for 5 years. So it feels, you hope that a market can create that kind of community where people want to keep coming back, and so we're real thankful. And then each year we get to add a couple of new vendors, which that's one of the things that Chef Jim helps us to sort out, because we do have applications each year, but we're real grateful that these longtime vendors have stuck with us.
Okay, so cilantro, you don't have to worry about trying to pull all those stems off. So on cilantro, I just get the you know, on the base end, get those, cut off those wider stems, and then just take the rest of it, because the stems are very, very tender. So then I take that leafy part, try to bunch it up, sort of like you do when you chiffonade your herbs, and then just take your knife, just give it a nice chop. Right, kind of keep your fingers turned. Sometimes you can find locally grown cilantro. I think some of our hydro growers have cilantro available on a pretty regular basis. And then, of course, this is another thing that you can grow yourself. Let's put a little bit of pepper, a little salt. I like using the coarser salts, like the kosher salts. And then let's...
These are not local limes.
Right. I do like having, as a chef, I like having some lemons and limes sort of in my pantry. Lemons and limes, what they do is they really brighten your flavors. So they're just sort of indispensable in that way. They really help sharpen, kind of bring your flavors into focus and help brighten your flavors. You know, you can kind of tell with the pico, it just sort of helps bring out the flavor of the tomatoes and the cilantro. So we'll put a little bit more lime juice in there and toss it up. So, really quick and easy. And anyone is welcome to come up and try this out of our big party bowl.
Thank you so much for talking to us about the Cherokee Purple and giving us this quick and easy recipe. I really appreciate your time today.
Yeah, you can get on the Slow Food website, research Ark of Taste, learn a little bit more about. You can actually nominate foods for the Ark of Taste that, if you think they meet criteria, their criteria. And then this book also is a really good one to look up. Bill Best, Saving Seeds, Preserving Taste. And after reading it, you could even meet Bill in person, because he's still in Berea and works with the Lexington Farmers Market up there. So we have it all ready for you. Come on up, and if you'd like to, try some of the pico.
Thanks. Thank you.